Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into a world where going to work meant gambling with your life. We're talking about Victorian England, an era of progress, industry, and innovations that came at a staggering human cost. Forget the romantic novels and period dramas. The real Victorian world was a place where children descended into pitch-black mines, where factory workers lost limbs to unstoppable machinery, and where a simple day's labor could end in suffocation, explosion, or a fall into molten metal. Before we dive into this dark chapter of history, take a moment to like the video if you're enjoying this kind of content. And please subscribe if you want more deep dives into history's grimmest corners. And let me know in the comments where you tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, settle in. Maybe grab a blanket, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey into Victorian England, where going to work every day meant facing death in ways we can barely imagine today. Congratulations! You've just woken up in Victorian England, sometime around 1850. The good news? The Industrial Revolution is in full swing, transforming Britain into the workshop of the world. The bad news? You're part of the machinery, and the machinery doesn't care if you live or die. Victorian England, roughly spanning from 1837 to 1901 during Queen Victoria's reign, was a time of unprecedented technological advancement. Steam power was revolutionizing manufacturing. Railways were connecting the nation. Cities were exploding in size. Britain was becoming the most powerful nation on earth, an empire upon which the sun never set. But here's what the history books often gloss over. This progress was built on bodies. Broken bodies, crushed bodies, burned, suffocated, and dismembered bodies. The Industrial Revolution didn't just transform society. It consumed it, one worker at a time. In the early Victorian period, there were virtually no safety regulations. The concept of workplace safety didn't exist. Factory owners operated under a simple philosophy: maximize profit, minimize cost. Workers were expendable. If you died on the job, there were 100 desperate people ready to take your place by morning. Life expectancy in industrial cities like Manchester and Liverpool hovered around 25 to 30 years for working-class people. Not because people couldn't live longer, but because they simply didn't survive their jobs, the diseases that came with them, or the appalling living conditions that accompanied industrial work. The Victorian workforce included everyone: men, women, and children as young as 4 or 5 years old. Yes, 4. Toddlers working 12 to 16-hour shifts in conditions that would make modern safety inspectors weep. And this wasn't hidden or shameful. It was normal, expected, just part of how things worked. So as you open your eyes in your cramped, damp tenement room, the factory whistle is already blowing. It's 5 a.m. and you're late. Your shift started at 4:30. That's a fine you can't afford, deducted from wages that barely keep you alive anyway. You pull on your threadbare clothes, still damp from yesterday's sweat and grime, and you head out into the choking fog of industrial England. The air tastes of coal smoke and chemical fumes. The sky is perpetually gray, and ahead of you looms the factory, the mine, the foundry, or whatever hell you call your workplace. A place where, statistically speaking, you're more likely to be injured today than not. Where your coworkers are missing fingers, eyes, hands, or limbs. Where the newest worker, a child of 7, will probably be dead within the year. Welcome to work in Victorian England, where every job is dangerous, and some are absolutely lethal. Coal mining. Let's start with one of the most notorious killers: coal mining. If you were born into a mining family in Victorian England, your fate was essentially sealed. You would go into the mines, and the mines would probably kill you. It was just a question of how and when. Coal was the lifeblood of Victorian industry. It powered the steam engines, heated the homes, and fueled the factories. Britain's entire industrial dominance depended on coal, and extracting it from the earth was one of the most dangerous occupations imaginable. Mines in Victorian England went deep, sometimes over 1,000 feet below the surface. The deeper they went, the more dangerous they became. Ventilation was poor to non-existent. Structural supports were minimal. Safety equipment was a fantasy. Miners descended into the earth with nothing but a pickaxe, a dim oil lamp, and the grim knowledge that they might not come back up. Let's talk about the workers. Adult men, called hewers, did the actual coal cutting. They worked in seams sometimes only 2 feet high, lying on their sides or crouching in impossible positions, swinging their picks in near total darkness. Their oil lamps provided barely enough light to see the coal face in front of them. The air was thick with coal dust that coated their lungs with every breath, a slow death sentence called black lung or pneumoconiosis. But here's where it gets darker. Children were essential to mining operations. Boys as young as 5 or 6 worked as trappers. Their job was to sit alone in complete darkness for 12 to 16 hours, opening and closing ventilation doors when they heard miners or coal carts approaching. Imagine being 6 years old, sitting in absolute blackness hundreds of feet underground, with only rats for company, fighting to stay awake because falling asleep meant you'd be beaten by the overseer. Slightly older children, aged 8 to 12, worked as hurriers or pushers. They dragged heavy coal carts through narrow tunnels, often on their hands and knees, with the cart attached to their waist by a chain that passed between their legs. The chain rubbed their skin raw, creating permanent scars and deformities. Many developed spinal problems that crippled them for life, assuming they lived that long. Girls worked underground too, despite what Victorian morality might suggest. They hauled coal, pushed carts, and worked in conditions identical to the boys. The 1842 Mines Act eventually banned women and girls from underground work, but that was more about Victorian sensibilities regarding female modesty than actual safety concerns. The boys stayed underground. Death came in many forms in the Victorian coal mine. Let's catalog them. Gas explosions. Mines naturally produced methane gas, called fire damp by miners. It was invisible, odorless, and explosive. A single spark from a pickaxe striking stone, or an oil lamp brought too close, could ignite an explosion that incinerated everyone in the tunnel. The Hartley Colliery disaster of 1862 killed 204 miners, including many children. The Oaks Colliery explosion in 1866 killed 361 men and boys. These weren't rare incidents. They were regular occurrences. Roof collapses. Mine tunnels were supported by wooden props, if they were supported at all. These props could rot, splinter, or simply give way under the immense weight of earth above. When a roof collapsed, miners were buried alive, crushed instantly if they were lucky, left to suffocate slowly in the dark if they weren't. Rescue efforts were often futile. The same instability that caused the collapse made rescue attempts deadly. Flooding. Underground water was a constant threat. Mines frequently broke into underground streams or waterlogged areas. When this happened, tunnels flooded rapidly, and miners drowned in the darkness, clawing at tunnel walls as water filled their lungs. Gas poisoning. Besides explosive methane, mines contained choke damp, carbon dioxide, white damp, carbon monoxide, and other toxic gases. These gases were heavier than air and pooled in low areas. Miners would suddenly find themselves unable to breathe, collapsing without warning. The canary in the coal mine wasn't a metaphor. It was actual practice. Miners brought caged canaries underground because the birds were more sensitive to toxic gases. When your canary died, you knew you had minutes to evacuate before you did too. Equipment accidents. The cages, elevators, that transported miners up and down the shaft were primitive and frequently failed. Cables snapped. Cages plummeted. In 1838, at the Husker Colliery, a sudden storm caused a stream to flood the mine. 26 children, ages 7 to 17, drowned trying to escape. The youngest was a 7-year-old named James Birkinshaw. And if the immediate dangers didn't kill you, the long-term effects would. Coal dust destroyed lungs. Miners developed chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and pneumoconiosis. By their 30s, many could barely breathe. By their 40s, if they lived that long, they were invalids, coughing up black phlegm and slowly suffocating. A miner's life expectancy was shockingly low. Many didn't live past 40. Their bodies were bent and broken, scarred by accidents, and twisted by years of working in impossible positions. And their wages? Barely enough to survive. Miners lived in company housing, bought food from company stores, and found themselves perpetually in debt to the mine owners. They were trapped, literally and economically. The Victorian coal mine was more than a workplace. It was a tomb that just happened to have living people in it, for now. The matchgirls, if coal mining was dangerous for its dramatic deaths, the matchmaking industry killed slowly, methodically, and with a particular cruelty that targeted the most vulnerable, young women and girls. In Victorian England, matches were an essential household item. Before them, starting a fire required flint and steel or expensive chemical lighters. The invention of phosphorus matches revolutionized daily life, but the women who made them paid with their faces, their bones, and their lives. Match factories, concentrated in London's East End, employed thousands of young women and girls, some as young as 13, though many were younger with forged papers. The work seemed simple enough. Dip wooden sticks into a mixture of white phosphorus, chemicals, and glue, then pack them into boxes. The factories were poorly ventilated, overheated, and filled with phosphorus fumes. White phosphorus, you see, is extraordinarily toxic, and the women worked with it barehanded, breathing its fumes for 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The first signs of poisoning were subtle: toothaches, swollen gums. The women often thought they just needed a dentist. But then came phossy jaw, officially called phosphorus necrosis of the jaw. It's exactly as horrific as it sounds. The phosphorus absorbed through the skin and lungs and accumulated in the jawbone. It caused the bone to literally rot and glow in the dark. Yes, you read that correctly. Victims' faces glowed green in the dark as their jawbones died and decayed while they were still alive. The pain was excruciating. The smell was putrid, the odor of rotting bone and infected tissue. The women's faces swelled grotesquely. Their teeth fell out. Abscesses formed and burst, leaking pus. The only treatment was surgical removal of the jaw, performed without anesthesia or with only minimal pain relief. Many women died from the surgery itself. Others died from infection afterward. Those who survived were left horribly disfigured, unable to eat properly, speak clearly, or find other work. The match factory owners knew about phossy jaw. Medical reports documented it. Doctors warned about it. But white phosphorus was cheap and effective, and worker safety wasn't profitable. The factories did nothing. When women became too sick to work, they were simply fired and replaced. The women earned poverty wages, usually around 4 shillings a week, barely enough to afford a single room and basic food. They were fined for talking, for being late, for dirty feet, for practically anything. These fines could cut their weekly pay in half. Working conditions were oppressive. The factory floors were crowded, hot, and poorly lit. Women stood at benches for entire shifts, performing the same repetitive motions thousands of times a day. Overseers watched constantly, ready to levy fines or physically punish slower workers. Sexual harassment from male supervisors was common and expected. In 1888, something remarkable happened. The match girls fought back. Led by Sarah Chapman and inspired by journalist Annie Besant's expose of their working conditions, around 1,400 women at the Bryant and May Match Factory went on strike. This was radical. Women, especially working-class women, weren't supposed to organize or demand rights. They were supposed to suffer in silence. The matchgirls strike, as it became known, shocked Victorian society. These young women, many still teenagers, stood up to one of London's largest employers and won. After 2 weeks, the factory owners agreed to abolish the worst fines, improve conditions slightly, and recognize the workers' union. But the victory was limited. White phosphorus continued to be used in British match factories until 1910, over 20 years later. During those decades, countless more women suffered and died from phossy jaw. The manufacturers knew of safe alternatives like red phosphorus, but they were slightly more expensive, so workers continued to be poisoned. The match girl's story reveals something crucial about Victorian England. Society knew these jobs were killing people. The information was public. Doctors published studies. Journalists wrote exposes. And yet, change came glacially slowly, if at all, because the lives of working-class women and children were considered acceptable losses in the march of industrial progress. Chimney sweeps picture this. You're a 6-year-old child, and you've just been sold by your parents to a chimney sweep master for a few pounds. Your new job is to climb inside chimneys while they're still warm from the aseo, previous night's fire, and scrape away the soot and creosote buildup. The chimneys are narrow, sometimes only 7 inches wide. You have to climb upward in complete darkness, using your elbows and knees to inch your way up 30, 40, sometimes 50 feet of vertical tunnel. You're naked or wearing only a thin shirt, because clothes would make you too big to fit. The soot fills your eyes, nose, and mouth. You can't breathe without inhaling it. You can't see. Your knees and elbows bleed from scraping against the rough brick. And behind you, below you, the master sweep is lighting a small fire to encourage you to climb faster. Welcome to the life of a Victorian chimney sweep's apprentice, one of the cruelest occupations in history. Chimney sweeping was necessary work. Victorian homes, from grand mansions to humble cottages, relied on fireplaces for heat and cooking. Chimneys needed regular cleaning to prevent fires, and the chimney's design, narrow and twisting, made mechanical cleaning impossible. The solution, in the twisted logic of Victorian England, was to send children up them. Master sweeps acquired boys, almost always boys, though occasionally girls, as young as 4 or 5. Many were orphans purchased from workhouses. Others were sold by destitute parents who couldn't afford to feed them. Some were kidnapped. Once acquired, these children became the property of the sweepmaster, who trained them through brutal methods. Training involved forcing terrified children up chimneys. At first, they refused, crying and clinging to the sweep. The solution was to light a fire beneath them. The choice was clear: climb or burn. Children learned quickly. Their survival instinct drove them upward into the suffocating darkness. The physical toll was immediate and permanent. Climbing chimneys destroyed children's bodies. Their knees and elbows were constantly raw and bleeding. The soot worked its way into these open wounds, causing infections. Over time, thick calluses formed, hardening their joints. Many boys developed grotesquely deformed knees and elbows, bent and twisted from climbing in confined spaces. Breathing soot for hours every day destroyed their lungs. Chronic coughing, bronchitis, and respiratory infections were universal among chimney sweeps. They inhaled not just soot, but also the chemicals used to treat the wood and coal, including lead and arsenic. But the most horrifying aspect was how they died, and they died frequently. Boys regularly became stuck in chimneys, wedged in narrow passages, unable to move up or down. Sometimes they panicked, which made them swell their chest, becoming even more trapped. They would suffocate slowly in the darkness, their screams muffled by stone and brick. The master sweep would try to pull them out, but often the child was stuck too tightly. Sometimes they would light another fire below to motivate the trapped boy to free himself. Instead, they roasted him alive. Climbing up meant climbing back down. Exhausted boys, their hands slippery with soot, their bodies weakened from malnutrition, frequently lost their grip and fell. A fall from 30 feet down a narrow chimney shaft meant broken bones at best, death at worst. Landing in a pile of hot ash and embers was common. If the chimney hadn't been properly cleaned previously, or if there was excessive creosote buildup, the chimney could catch fire while the boy was inside. Creosote burns extremely hot. Boys would be incinerated in the chimney, their screams echoing down into the house. Chimney sweeps cancer was the first occupational cancer ever identified, documented by Percival Pott in 1775. The constant exposure to soot caused scrotal cancer in adolescent and young adult sweeps. The cancer was aggressive and almost always fatal. Doctors knew what caused it. They documented it in medical journals. And yet, the practice of sending boys up chimneys continued for decades. The working day for a climbing boy started before dawn. Master sweeps would wake their apprentices around 4 a.m. and take them through wealthy neighborhoods, calling out their services. A typical day might involve climbing a dozen or more chimneys. The boys were rarely fed properly. Masters saw no point in wasting money on food for children who might die at any moment. At night, the boys often slept in cellars on bags of soot. They had no beds, no blankets, no bath. They were covered in soot permanently, their skin stained gray-black. The soot worked into their pores and never fully came out. Even on their rare days off, they looked like shadow creatures. Public awareness of their plight grew slowly. In 1788, Parliament passed an act that was supposed to protect climbing boys, requiring masters to apprentice them properly and limiting their working hours. It was completely ignored. In 1834, another act supposedly banned the apprenticeship of boys under 10. Also ignored. In 1840, another act raised the minimum age to 16 and required masters to provide proper washing facilities. Still ignored. Why? Because enforcing these laws was nearly impossible. Chimney sweeps worked in private homes. Who was going to inspect every household to ensure the sweep was following regulations? And the wealthy clients who employed the sweeps didn't care. They wanted clean chimneys, and if that meant a 6-year-old boy suffered, well, that was unfortunate, but not their concern. It wasn't until 1875, well into Victoria's reign, that the use of climbing boys was finally effectively banned. By then, mechanical brushes and improved chimney designs made child labor less necessary. But for decades, thousands of boys had been sacrificed to keep Britain's fireplaces clean. The chimney sweep's apprentice represents everything wrong with Victorian attitudes toward child labor. They knew it was happening. They knew it was harmful. They even passed laws against it. But enforcement was non-existent because society fundamentally didn't value these children's lives. Factory workers. Victorian factories were temples of progress. Magnificent buildings where steam-powered machinery transformed raw materials into finished goods at unprecedented speeds. They were also slaughterhouses that consumed workers with mechanical efficiency. Textile mills, ironworks, pottery factories, paper mills, each had its own specific dangers, but they all shared common characteristics: long hours, dangerous machinery, no safety equipment, and a complete disregard for human life. Let's start with textile mills, perhaps the most iconic Victorian factories. Cities like Manchester, Bradford, and Bolton were dominated by massive mill buildings, some employing thousands of workers. Inside, the noise was deafening, a constant thundering of steam engines and clattering of looms that made conversation impossible and left workers partially deaf. The machinery was fast, unguarded, and unforgiving. Power looms, spinning jennies, and carding machines operated at high speeds with exposed gears, belts, and moving parts. Workers, many of them women and children, had to reach into operating machines to clear jams, adjust threads, or retrieve broken materials. And then the machine would claim them. A moment's inattention, a loose sleeve, a strand of hair not properly tied back, and the machinery would catch hold. It happened constantly. Workers were dragged into machines, their hands crushed in gears, arms torn off by belts, bodies pulled into mechanical workings and mangled beyond recognition. Children were especially vulnerable. They were employed specifically because their small hands could reach into tight spaces in the machinery. But small hands could also get caught more easily. Children as young as 6 worked 12 to 14-hour shifts, exhaustion making accidents inevitable. When a child became drowsy and stumbled into a machine, the machine didn't stop. It kept running, with pieces of the child now part of its mechanism, while overseers yelled at other workers to keep the production line moving. Factory owners provided no compensation for injuries. If you lost a hand in the machinery, you were fired and replaced by the next desperate worker. No job, no income, no medical care beyond what charitable hospitals might provide. Your family, now without your earnings, would likely end up in the workhouse. The air in textile factories was deliberately kept hot and humid to prevent threads from breaking. This created a greenhouse environment where temperatures regularly exceeded 80 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Combined with the lint and fiber particles floating in the air, workers developed a condition called mill fever, severe respiratory distress that left them coughing and feverish. Long-term exposure led to byssinosis, or brown lung disease, a chronic condition that slowly destroyed the lungs. But textile mills weren't even the most dangerous factories. That distinction might belong to the metalworks. Iron foundries and steel mills operated at temperatures that transformed buildings into infernos. Workers poured molten metal, operated massive hammers and presses, and worked with materials heated to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Burns were constant. Splashes of molten metal could blind workers, sear through clothing and flesh, or cause fourth-degree burns that destroyed muscle and bone. Protective equipment consisted of maybe a leather apron. No face shields, no heat-resistant gloves, no safety protocols. The massive steam hammers used to forge iron and steel were particularly deadly. These hammers weighed several tons and struck with tremendous force. Workers had to position metal pieces beneath the hammer, then leap clear before it descended. Timing was everything. Get the timing wrong by half a second, and you were crushed into the factory floor, your body compressed to a fraction of its normal thickness. Explosions were another constant threat. Boilers that powered the machinery operated at high pressure, with minimal safety valves. When a boiler exploded, and they did regularly, the blast could demolish an entire factory floor, killing dozens of workers instantly. The 1860 boiler explosion at the Fenny Stratford Works killed 5 workers and injured many more. Such incidents were so common, they barely made the newspapers, unless the death toll was exceptional. Chemical factories presented yet another category of dangers. The production of sulfuric acid, bleach, dyes, and other industrial chemicals exposed workers to toxic fumes, caustic liquids, and explosive compounds. Workers in chemical plants developed distinctive conditions. Lucifer poisoning affected those making matches, as we discussed earlier. Lead poisoning destroyed the nervous systems of workers in white lead factories, causing tremors, paralysis, and insanity. Mercury poisoning affected felt hat makers, hence the phrase mad as a hatter, causing neurological damage, tremors, and psychological disturbances. The chlorine used in bleach production was particularly nasty. Chlorine gas burns the lungs and causes fluid buildup that essentially drowns victims from the inside. Workers in chlorine-producing facilities had shortened lifespans measured in years, not decades. And throughout all of this, factory owners maintained that accidents were the workers' fault. Injured workers were characterized as careless, drunk, or simply stupid. The idea that perhaps machines should have guards, that perhaps 14-hour shifts for exhausted children might be dangerous, that perhaps workers deserved protective equipment, these concepts were dismissed as interfering with business and progress. Some reforms did eventually come. The Factory Acts, passed gradually throughout the Victorian period, attempted to limit working hours for children and mandate basic safety measures. But enforcement was laughable. Factory inspectors were few, and owners were often given advance notice of inspections, allowing them to temporarily hide their youngest workers or improve conditions for a day. The Victorian factory was a monument to the idea that human life was less valuable than production efficiency. Workers weren't employees. They were consumable components in the industrial machine, to be used up and replaced as needed. Shipyard workers. Victorian Britain ruled the waves, and that meant building ships, lots of them. Shipyards dominated port cities like Glasgow, Belfast, Newcastle, and Liverpool. These sprawling industrial sites employed tens of thousands of workers, constructing everything from small fishing vessels to massive ocean liners and naval warships. Ship construction in the Victorian era was a brutal, dangerous business that combined all the hazards of metalworking, heavy construction, and waterfront work into one deadly package. Let's start with the most iconic Victorian shipbuilding project, the construction of iron and steel ships. Before the Victorian era, ships were made of wood, but iron and then steel revolutionized shipbuilding, allowing for larger, stronger vessels. It also made construction far more dangerous. Riveting was the primary method of attaching steel plates to a ship's frame. This required teams of workers. A heater who heated rivets to red-hot temperatures, a holder-on who positioned the rivet, and a riveter who hammered it into place. This work was performed on scaffolding dozens or even hundreds of feet above the ground or water. Falls were constant. Scaffolding in Victorian shipyards was primitive, often just wooden planks lashed together. Safety harnesses didn't exist. Workers balanced on narrow planks while handling heavy tools and red-hot metal. When someone fell, they plummeted onto the concrete dock, into the ship's partially constructed hull, or into the water. A fall from 50 feet was usually fatal. A fall into the cold harbor water meant drowning, especially since many shipyard workers never learned to swim. The riveters themselves faced unique dangers. The noise of hundreds of hammers striking metal all day caused universal hearing loss. Riveting teams worked inside the ship's hull, in confined spaces with no ventilation. The heat from the rivets made these spaces like ovens. Workers regularly collapsed from heat exhaustion. But the most distinctive injury was rivet catcher's hand. When a red-hot rivet was tossed from the heater to the holder-on, yes, they literally threw red-hot pieces of metal across the worksite. Occasionally, the catcher missed. The rivet would strike their hand, arm, or body, causing severe burns. Missing a catch could mean third-degree burns, or, if the rivet fell into clothing, even worse injuries as the worker struggled to remove their burning clothes while the metal seared their flesh. Shipyard workers also faced the danger of the materials themselves. Steel plates weighed hundreds of pounds. When a crane dropped a plate, anyone beneath was crushed instantly. Chains broke, cables snapped. Massive pieces of ship structure fell without warning. The holds of ships under construction were death traps. Poorly ventilated, filled with toxic fumes from paint and tar, and often flooded with water. These spaces killed through suffocation, toxic exposure, or drowning. Workers sent into holds to install equipment sometimes simply didn't come back out. Their bodies were discovered hours later, overcome by fumes or trapped by rising water. Launch day, which should have been a celebration, was often deadly. When a ship was launched, it slid down wooden ways into the water. This was a barely controlled process, involving enormous forces and masses. If the launch went wrong, if the ship stuck or tipped, workers on the ways could be crushed. Spectators watching launches were sometimes killed when ships created massive waves that swept people into the water. The Daphne disaster of 1883 illustrates the dangers perfectly. The Daphne, a ship under construction in Glasgow, was launched with over 200 workers still aboard, completing interior work. During the launch, the ship capsized, trapping workers inside. 124 men and boys drowned, trapped in the overturning vessel. The youngest victim was a 14-year-old apprentice named John Brown. Dock work, closely related to shipbuilding, was equally dangerous. Dockers loaded and unloaded ships, often working with heavy cargo suspended by cranes and pulleys. When a load broke free, workers beneath were crushed. Cargo included dangerous materials, barrels of chemicals, crates of explosives, bales of cotton that could spontaneously combust. Docker work was also casual labor, meaning workers gathered each morning, hoping to be selected for a day's work. There were always more workers than jobs, creating desperate competition. Men would fight for the chance to risk their lives for a day's wages. The waterfront itself was hazardous. Docks were slippery, poorly lit at night, and often foggy. Workers regularly fell into the water between the dock and the ship. The gap could crush someone if the ship shifted. The water was filthy, polluted with industrial waste, raw sewage, and oil. Even if you could swim, surviving a fall into Victorian harbor water was difficult. Shipyard workers developed a fatalistic culture. Accidents were so common that workers spoke of certain areas or tasks as widowmakers. They knew their job was killing them, but what choice did they have? The pay was relatively good compared to other manual labor, and for men supporting families, the risk was unavoidable. Victorian shipyards built the vessels that made Britain a global power, but they did so one dead worker at a time. The poison trades. Victorian England experienced a chemical revolution. New dyes, new medicines, new materials, all created through industrial chemistry. But the workers who produced these chemicals paid with their health and lives, exposed to substances so toxic that modern safety regulations would never permit their use. Let's talk about arsenic, a Victorian favorite. Arsenic was everywhere in Victorian life, in wallpaper, in fabric dyes, in paints, and in cosmetics. The vibrant green color called Scheele's green or Paris green was particularly popular. It was also made with arsenic. Workers in arsenic-related industries, dye makers, wallpaper manufacturers, and painters were constantly exposed. Arsenic dust filled their lungs. Arsenic compounds absorbed through their skin. The symptoms started subtly: stomach pain, vomiting, diarrhea. Then came neurological effects: numbness, tremors, paralysis. Long-term exposure caused cancer, particularly of the skin and lungs. Arsenical poisoning was so common in these trades that it was considered an occupational hazard, not a problem to be solved. Workers knew they were being poisoned, but again, what choice did they have? Mercury poisoning was another widespread occupational disease. We touched on hatters earlier, but mercury was used in many industries: mirror making, thermometer production, and gold extraction. Hatters made felt hats by treating fur with mercury nitrate. This process, called carroting because it turned the fur orange, was done in poorly ventilated workshops. The mercury fumes caused hatter shakes, a tremor that worsened over time. It also caused psychological changes: irritability, depression, memory loss, and hallucinations. Hence, mad as a hatter. This wasn't a colorful idiom. It was a medical description of mercury poisoning's effects on the brain. Mirror makers backed glass with mercury amalgams. The process required heating mercury, which released toxic fumes. Workers in mirror factories rarely lived past 40. They developed the same tremors and psychological problems as hatters, along with kidney failure and respiratory diseases. Lead poisoning affected multiple trades. White lead, used in paint, was manufactured by exposing lead to vinegar fumes in a process that took weeks. Workers had to enter the rooms where this process occurred, scraping off the white lead crust that formed. The dust was intensely toxic. Lead poisoning, or plumbism, causes anemia, abdominal pain, constipation, headaches, irritability, and in severe cases, seizures and coma. It also causes a distinctive blue line to appear on the gums, called Burton's line, which became a common sight among paint workers. Children born to mothers exposed to lead often suffered brain damage. Yet white lead production continued throughout the Victorian period because it made excellent paint. The pottery industry was particularly deadly. Stoke-on-Trent, the heart of England's pottery industry, had some of the highest mortality rates in the country. Potters were exposed to lead in the glazes, silica dust from the clay, and toxic fumes from the kilns. Silicosis, caused by inhaling silica dust, destroyed potters' lungs. The fine dust scarred lung tissue, making breathing progressively more difficult. There was no cure. Potters who worked in the industry for 20 years rarely lived to see 50. The process of dipping pottery in lead glaze was especially dangerous. Workers' hands were constantly in contact with lead compounds. They breathed lead-laden air. They often ate their lunches without washing their hands, ingesting lead directly. Lead-related diseases killed or disabled thousands of pottery workers. Industrial chemical production was a nightmare. Sulfuric acid, known as oil of vitriol, was essential for numerous industrial processes. Its production involved heating sulfur and niter in lead chambers, a process that released sulfur dioxide fumes that burned workers' lungs and eyes. Workers in sulfuric acid plants developed chronic bronchitis, lost their teeth to acid erosion, and suffered chemical burns from splashes and spills. The factories themselves were corroded hulks where metal rusted rapidly and wooden structures rotted from acid exposure. Chlorine gas production, used for bleaching, was equally horrific. Chlorine is a greenish-yellow gas that burns the lungs on contact. Even small exposures cause coughing, choking, and chest pain. Larger exposures are fatal, causing pulmonary edema, essentially drowning in your own fluids. Yet workers in chlorine plants labored with minimal protection. When leaks occurred, and they occurred regularly, workers died gasping for breath, while others fled, leaving their colleagues behind. Phosphorus, which we discussed with matchgirls, was used in other industries too. Fireworks, fertilizers, and rat poison. Each industry had its own population of poisoned workers, their jaws glowing in the dark as their bones died. Victorian society's attitude toward these poison trades was appalling. Medical professionals documented the diseases. They published papers describing the pathology. They knew exactly what was causing the suffering. But the industries continued unchanged because worker health was considered less important than production. Some workers tried to protect themselves with crude methods: cloth masks, grease rubbed on skin, milk drunk to neutralize poison. It didn't. But these measures were inadequate against industrial toxins. The poison trades killed slowly and invisibly. Unlike a factory accident that crushed someone instantly, chemical poisoning took years. Workers became progressively sicker, less able to work, eventually unemployable. They died in poorhouses, forgotten, their bodies saturated with industrial poisons. Victorian England was built on chemistry, and chemistry was built on bodies. Agricultural workers, when we think of dangerous Victorian jobs, we imagine factories and mines, but agricultural work, supposedly wholesome and natural, killed and injured thousands of workers every year. Victorian agriculture was undergoing mechanization. Steam-powered threshing machines, reapers, and other equipment were replacing hand labor. These machines were as dangerous as their factory counterparts, with the added hazard of being operated by workers with even less training in fields far from medical help. Threshing machines were particularly deadly. These machines separated grain from stalks using rotating drums with metal teeth. Workers fed sheaves of grain into the machine's mouth, standing inches from the rotating mechanism. If clothing, hair, or a hand got caught, the machine pulled the worker in. Farm workers were regularly mangled by threshing machines, losing arms, hands, or being pulled into the mechanism entirely. These accidents happened in remote fields, far from doctors. A worker might bleed to death before help arrived. Even if they survived, without proper medical care, infection almost always set in. Amputation, performed by a local doctor in the farm kitchen, was often fatal. Harvest work itself was grueling and dangerous. Workers using scythes and sickles regularly suffered serious cuts. A slip with a scythe could sever an artery. A misplaced hand while bundling grain could mean losing fingers to a companion's blade. Children worked the harvest alongside adults. They gathered sheaves, scared birds, and operated equipment they were too small to manage safely. Accidents involving children were common and often fatal. The introduction of steam-powered equipment added new dangers. Steam engines were mobile boilers, operating at high pressure. When one exploded, workers nearby were killed by the blast or scalded by superheated steam. Runaways, engines that lost control on slopes, crushed workers, or set fields ablaze. But agricultural work killed in less traumatic ways too. Exposure to weather was a constant threat. Harvest work occurred in all conditions. Heat stroke killed workers during hot summers. Hypothermia killed during spring and autumn cold snaps. Rain and cold led to pneumonia, which was often fatal before antibiotics. Agricultural workers also handled dangerous animals. Bulls, stallions, and even cows killed or severely injured workers. Horses kicked, bit, and trampled. A frightened horse could smash a worker against a wall or drag them by a caught foot. Then there were the diseases. Anthrax, transmitted from livestock, could kill through respiratory infection or blood poisoning. Rabies, though less common, was uniformly fatal. Tetanus, from soil bacteria entering wounds, killed through muscular paralysis and suffocation. Rat-borne diseases were endemic. Leptospirosis, or rat catcher's disease, caused by bacteria in rat urine, led to kidney failure and liver damage. Farm workers, constantly exposed to rat-infested grain stores, frequently contracted it. Living conditions for agricultural workers were arguably worse than for urban factory workers. Farm laborers lived in tied cottages, meaning their home was tied to their employment. Lose your job, and you lost your home immediately. These cottages were often single-room structures, damp, poorly ventilated, and overcrowded. Agricultural wages were lower than factory wages. Farm workers often relied on parish relief to survive. Malnutrition was widespread, making workers more susceptible to disease and less able to recover from injuries. The seasonality of agricultural work meant periods of unemployment during winter. Workers had to find other labor or rely on the workhouse, and the workhouse was its own kind of death sentence, a place of deliberate hardship designed to discourage the poor from seeking help. Victorian agricultural workers were largely forgotten in the narrative of industrial progress. They weren't part of the dramatic story of factories and railways, but they died in fields and barns, crushed by machines, killed by infections, slowly worn down by exposure and poverty. Construction workers. Victorian England was a nation under construction. Railways, canals, bridges, tunnels, buildings, everywhere you looked, something was being built. And everywhere something was being built, construction workers were dying. Railway construction was particularly deadly. Britain's railway network expanded rapidly during the Victorian era, connecting cities and transforming transportation. But building railways meant cutting through hills, bridging valleys, and tunneling through mountains. Navvies, the men who built the railways, worked with picks, shovels, and explosives. Their work was brutal, 12-hour days of hard physical labor in all weather conditions. They moved tons of earth by hand, with only wheelbarrows and muscle power. Explosives killed regularly. Navvies drilled holes into rock, packed them with gunpowder or dynamite, lit fuses, and ran. Sometimes the fuse burned too quickly. Sometimes workers miscalculated and didn't get clear in time. Sometimes the explosive was unstable and detonated unexpectedly. Explosions buried workers, blew them apart, or left them maimed and blinded. Tunnel work was especially hazardous. The Woodhead Tunnel, completed in 1845, killed at least 32 workers during its construction and injured over 200 seriously. Workers died from explosions, roof collapses, flooding, and toxic gases. The tunnel was over 3 miles long, and working inside, it meant being far from safety if anything went wrong. Building bridges was no safer. Workers suspended high above rivers and gorges, working on scaffolding that swayed in the wind. Falls were common and usually fatal. The Tay Bridge disaster of 1879, while occurring after construction, highlighted the dangers. When the bridge collapsed during a storm, a train plunged into the river, killing everyone aboard. But during the bridge's construction, workers had already died from falls and accidents. Urban construction killed in different ways. Building the grand Victorian structures we admire today, the railway stations, the government buildings, the townhouses required workers to labor at dangerous heights with minimal safety equipment. Scaffolding was often inadequate. Wooden planks balanced on simple supports. No railings, no harnesses. Bricklayers, carpenters, and stonemasons worked hundreds of feet above the ground. A loose board, a moment's inattention, and they fell to their deaths on the pavement below. Materials handling caused countless injuries. Bricks, stones, timber, all had to be lifted manually or with basic pulley systems. When ropes broke or pulleys failed, loads fell, crushing workers below. Demolition was particularly dangerous. Victorian cities were constantly being rebuilt, with old structures demolished to make way for new ones. Demolition workers had to manually dismantle buildings, often unstable structures that could collapse without warning. Workers were buried in rubble, crushed by falling walls, or fell through weakened floors. Sewer construction deserves special mention. Victorian cities were retrofitting medieval street layouts with modern sewer systems. This meant digging up streets and laying miles of underground pipes. Workers labored in trenches that could collapse, burying them alive. They worked in confined spaces filled with sewer gases, methane, hydrogen sulfide, and carbon dioxide. These gases exploded, poisoned, and asphyxiated workers regularly. The construction of London's sewer system, under Joseph Bazalgette's direction, was an engineering marvel, but it came at a human cost. Workers died in trench collapses, from disease exposure, and from explosions of sewer gas. Construction workers, like other Victorian laborers, had no safety net. An injury meant unemployment. Death meant destitution for their families. Many construction workers were itinerant, moving from project to project, which made them even more vulnerable. They had no community support, no permanent home, and no one to advocate for them if they were injured or killed. The great Victorian buildings, bridges, and railways that still stand today are monuments built on bones. Every grand structure represents workers who fell, who were crushed, who were buried, and who sacrificed their lives so that Victoria's empire could be built ever higher and faster. Sailors and the merchant navy Victorian Britain was a maritime empire, the world's dominant naval power. The phrase, "Britannia rules the waves," wasn't just patriotic boasting, it was economic reality. British merchant ships carried goods across the globe, and the Royal Navy protected trade routes and projected imperial power. But for the men who actually sailed these vessels, the sea was a constant, patient killer. Let's start with merchant sailors, the men who crewed cargo ships, passenger vessels, and whaling ships. These weren't the glamorous naval officers of fiction. They were working-class men, often from desperate circumstances, who signed aboard ships for wages that barely kept them alive. Shipboard life was brutal. Sailors worked in all weather conditions, climbing rigging in storms, handling heavy cargo, and maintaining vessels with their bare hands. The work was physically exhausting and extremely dangerous. Falling from the rigging was a constant threat. Masts on large sailing ships rose over 100 feet above the deck. Sailors had to climb these masts in all conditions, often in darkness, rain, or gale-force winds, to adjust sails. The rigging was made of rope that became slippery when wet. There were no safety harnesses, no nets to catch falling men. When someone fell, they either hit the deck and died instantly from the impact, or they fell into the sea and drowned. Even if a man fell into the water near the ship, rescue was unlikely. Victorian ships couldn't stop quickly. By the time they could turn around, the sailor had usually disappeared beneath the waves. Many sailors never learned to swim, believing that drowning quickly was preferable to prolonging the inevitable if they fell overboard far from land. Storms killed ships and crews regularly. Victorian weather forecasting was primitive. Ships sailed into hurricanes, typhoons, and massive Atlantic storms with no warning. When a storm hit, sailors had to fight to save the ship, reducing sails, securing cargo, and pumping out water, all while waves crashed over the deck and winds threatened to tear the masts down. Shipwrecks were common. The waters around Britain alone claimed hundreds of ships every year. Rocky coastlines, fog, storms, and navigation errors sent vessels onto rocks or reefs. When a wooden ship struck rocks, it could break apart in minutes. Sailors trapped below decks had no chance of escape. Those who made it into the water faced drowning in frigid seas, often within sight of land, but unable to reach it. The records are staggering. In 1854 alone, over 1,000 British ships were wrecked and approximately 1,500 sailors died. This was not an exceptional year. It was typical. Cargo itself was dangerous. Ships carried everything: coal, grain, timber, livestock, and dangerous goods like gunpowder, chemicals, and flammable oils. Cargoes could shift in heavy seas, destabilizing the ship. Grain could spontaneously ferment and produce explosive gases. Livestock could panic and trample each other, or die and contaminate the hold. Loading and unloading cargo killed regularly. Dock workers, whom we discussed earlier, faced similar dangers to the sailors who had to manage cargo at sea. Heavy crates suspended by ropes and pulleys could fall, crushing men on deck. Chain and rope under tension could snap, whipping across the deck and cutting men in half. Disease was another killer. Ships were floating disease vectors. Sailors lived in cramped, poorly ventilated quarters below deck. Sanitation was minimal. Fresh water was limited and often contaminated. Food spoiled rapidly. These conditions bred typhus, dysentery, cholera, and scurvy. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was particularly associated with sailors. On long voyages without fresh fruits or vegetables, sailors' gums would swell and bleed, their teeth would fall out, old wounds would reopen, and eventually they would die. By the late Victorian period, the connection between citrus fruits and scurvy prevention was understood, but not all ships carried adequate supplies, especially on longer voyages. Whaling was among the most dangerous maritime occupations. British and American whaling ships hunted sperm whales, right whales, and other species in remote waters. The work required sailors to pursue whales in small boats, harpoon them, and then hold on as the wounded whale fled, dragging the boat behind it in what was called a Nantucket sleigh ride. Whales fought back. A whale could smash a boat with its tail, capsizing it and throwing men into freezing water. Sperm whales could bite boats in half. Wounded whales sometimes turned on their attackers, deliberately ramming boats or crushing them. If sailors survived the hunt and successfully killed the whale, they then had to tow it back to the ship and process it. This meant cutting up a massive carcass while it floated in the water, slippery with blood and oil. Men working on the whale's floating body could slip into the water and be eaten by sharks attracted by the blood. The flensing knives used to strip blubber were razor sharp, and accidents were common, with men slashing themselves or each other in the blood-slicked chaos. Processing whale blubber on deck involved boiling it in trypots to extract oil. These were essentially massive cauldrons of boiling oil on a wooden ship. Fires could spread, igniting the ship. Sailors could fall into the boiling oil, suffering horrific burns. The Royal Navy, while more organized than merchant shipping, was no safer. Naval sailors faced all the same maritime dangers, plus the added threat of combat. During the Victorian period, Britain fought numerous naval actions, the Crimean War, various colonial conflicts, and constant anti-piracy operations. Naval combat meant facing cannon fire, exploding shells, and wooden splinters that became deadly projectiles when cannonballs struck the ship's hull. Below-deck gun crews worked in confined, smoke-filled spaces where the concussion from firing could rupture. Eardrums and the recoil could crush men against the opposite wall. Naval discipline was also brutal. Flogging, the punishment of whipping with a cat-o'-nine tails, was common until it was abolished in 1879. Sailors could be flogged for minor infractions, receiving dozens or even hundreds of lashes that shredded their backs. Some died from the punishment itself. Others died from infections afterward. Press ganging, the forced recruitment of men into the Royal Navy, continued into the early Victorian period. Men were literally kidnapped from ports and forced to serve. This practice meant that some naval sailors didn't choose the sea. They were forced into it. For all sailors, merchant or naval, the sea was always waiting. Victorian maritime technology was improving. Steam power was slowly replacing sail. Iron hulls were replacing wood, but the ocean remained as dangerous as ever. The sea took men without warning, without mercy, and often without leaving any trace that they had ever existed. Tanneries and slaughterhouses. If you wanted to experience hell on earth in Victorian England, visit a tannery or slaughterhouse. These were places where the sights, smells, and dangers were so extreme that even other working-class people avoided them. The men, women, and children who worked there occupied the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. Let's start with slaughterhouses. Victorian England consumed enormous quantities of meat, and that meant killing animals on an industrial scale. Slaughterhouses were concentrated in specific districts of cities, places where the screams of dying animals and the stench of blood and offal were constant. The work was exactly as brutal as you imagine. Animals were driven into killing floors, where slaughtermen used various methods to kill them. Sledgehammers to the head for cattle, knives for pigs and sheep, clubs for calves. This was before humane slaughter techniques. Animals often didn't die with the first blow, requiring multiple strikes while they thrashed and screamed. Workers were regularly injured by panicked animals. A cow weighing over 1,000 pounds could kick with devastating force, breaking bones or crushing skulls. Bulls were particularly dangerous, sometimes breaking free and goring workers with their horns. Pigs, despite their size, could bite severely, and horses would kick and bite. The actual killing was just the beginning. Carcasses had to be processed, gutted, skinned, and butchered. The knives used were extremely sharp, and workers handled them while standing in blood and animal fluids that made floors treacherously slippery. Cuts were constant. Deep cuts to hands and arms, severed fingers, and occasionally fatal wounds to major arteries. The intestines and organs removed from animals contained parasites and bacteria. Workers regularly contracted diseases from the animals they processed: anthrax, tuberculosis, brucellosis, and various parasitic infections. There was no protective equipment. Men worked with bare hands, their arms elbow-deep in animal carcasses. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, feces, stomach contents, and rotting tissue created a stench that permeated everything. Workers' clothes, skin, and hair were saturated with it. They lived with the smell constantly, taking it home to their families. Now, if you thought slaughterhouses were bad, tanneries were worse, much worse. Tanning is the process of turning animal hides into leather. It's a necessary process. Victorian England needed leather for shoes, belts, saddles, and industrial uses, but it's also one of the most disgusting and dangerous occupations ever devised. The process started with raw hides, animal skins that still had flesh, fat, and hair attached. These hides were often partially decomposed by the time they reached the tannery because decay helped loosen the hair. The smell of rotting flesh was the first assault on tannery workers. The hides were soaked in vats of lime to remove hair and remaining flesh. Lime is caustic. It burned workers' skin and eyes. Men spent hours with their arms submerged in lime solutions, scraping hides clean. Their hands became raw and chemical burned, the skin cracked and bleeding. Next came the truly horrific part, puring. This involved soaking the hides in solutions of dog feces, pigeon droppings, or other animal waste. The enzymes in the excrement broke down proteins in the hide, softening it. Workers waded through vats of liquid feces, handling hides that had been soaking in it for days. The stench was beyond description. Tanneries could be smelled from miles away. The smell clung to workers so intensely that they were socially ostracized. Tanners lived in separate neighborhoods because no one else would tolerate their presence. Children of tanners were bullied mercilessly. Tanners were often refused service in shops and pubs. After puring came the actual tanning, which used different chemicals depending on the method. Vegetable tanning used tannic acid from tree bark. Chrome tanning, introduced in the Victorian period, used chromium salts, which were toxic. Workers stood in vats of tanning solution for hours, their feet and legs constantly exposed to chemicals. They developed chronic skin conditions, ulcers, and chemical burns. The chromium used in chrome tanning caused chrome holes, ulcers that ate through skin and refused to heal. Respiratory diseases were universal. The fumes from lime, the particles from dried excrement, the chemicals from tanning solutions, all destroyed workers' lungs. Tanners died young, often in their 30s or 40s, from lung disease. The physical labor was also grueling. Wet hides weighed hundreds of pounds. Workers had to lift them, move them between vats, and stretch them on frames to dry. Back injuries, hernias, and muscle strains were common. Children worked in tanneries, doing the worst jobs. They scraped hides, carried buckets of lime and excrement, and worked in the most poorly ventilated areas. The chemicals stunted their growth and damaged their development. Many died before reaching adulthood. Both slaughterhouses and tanneries were located in the poorest districts, near rivers where they could dump their waste directly into the water. This contaminated water supplies and spread disease throughout working-class neighborhoods. The waste from these industries was staggering. Blood, offal, feces, lime, and chemical runoff all went into rivers. The Thames in London was so polluted that it became essentially a dead river, devoid of fish and so foul that members of Parliament had to abandon sessions due to the smell during the Great Stink of 1858. Workers in these industries were trapped. The work was so stigmatized that leaving the industry was nearly impossible. No other employer would hire someone who smelled like a tannery. Families became dynasties of slaughtermen or tanners, passing the misery down through generations. These workers were essential. Victorian society needed meat and leather, but the people who provided these necessities were treated as less than human, forced to work in conditions that destroyed their health, shortened their lives, and marked them as social outcasts. Railway workers. Railways were the defining technology of the Victorian age, shrinking distances and revolutionizing commerce. But for the men who actually operated and maintained the railways, this technological marvel was a constant source of danger. We already discussed the navvies who built the railways. Now let's look at those who worked on them once they were operational. The engine drivers, firemen, signalmen, pointsmen, porters, and track maintenance workers. Engine drivers and firemen operated the locomotives themselves. This might sound prestigious, and it was considered a skilled position, but it was extraordinarily dangerous. Locomotives were essentially mobile bombs, boilers operating at high pressure with minimal safety features. Boiler explosions killed crews regularly. When a locomotive boiler exploded, it could destroy the entire engine and kill everyone nearby. The explosion might result from poor maintenance, faulty pressure gauges, or simply pushing the engine too hard to meet schedules. In 1853, a locomotive exploded at Birmingham New Street Station, killing the driver and fireman and injuring dozens of passengers. This was not exceptional. It happened routinely. Even without explosions, the locomotive cab was hazardous. It was exposed to weather. There was no enclosed cab on most Victorian engines, just a small shelter. Crews worked in blazing heat from the firebox in summer and freezing cold in winter. They breathed smoke and coal dust constantly, developing the same lung diseases as miners. The fireman's job was to shovel coal into the firebox, maintaining steam pressure. This meant shoveling several tons of coal during a shift, repetitive labor that destroyed backs and shoulders. The firebox door opened to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Burns were common, especially when coal dust in the air ignited suddenly. Coupling and uncoupling railway cars was one of the most dangerous regular tasks. Victorian couplings were not automatic. Workers had to step between cars as they were moving, lift a heavy coupling pin, and drop it into place. Timing was critical. If the worker was too slow, or if the train moved unexpectedly, they were crushed between the cars. The statistics are horrific. Between 1875 and 1900, over 18,000 railway workers were killed in Britain, and hundreds of thousands more were injured. Crushed hands, severed fingers, amputated limbs, these were considered normal occupational hazards. Shunting, the process of moving cars around in rail yards, was particularly deadly. Shunters had to climb on moving cars, ride on their sides or tops, and leap between them. A slip meant falling between the cars and being run over by the wheels, which would cut a person in half or crush them beyond recognition. Track maintenance workers, called plate layers, faced constant danger from passing trains. They worked on active tracks, relying on lookouts to warn them of approaching trains. But warnings sometimes came too late, especially in fog, rain, or at night. Trains struck and killed workers regularly. Some were hit by trains they never saw coming. Others misjudged their distance and couldn't clear the track in time. The work itself was physically brutal. Rails and sleepers, crosties, weighed hundreds of pounds. Moving them required teams of men using brute force. Injuries from lifting and carrying were constant. Men developed hernias, back problems, and chronic pain. Signalmen controlled train movements from signal boxes, preventing collisions by setting signals and points, switches. This was mentally exhausting work, requiring constant attention. A moment's inattention, a misunderstood message, or a mechanical failure could cause a collision. And collisions happened frequently. Victorian railway signaling was primitive compared to modern standards. The telegraph system for coordinating train movements was new and sometimes unreliable. Human error was inevitable when signalmen worked 12 to 16-hour shifts with no breaks. When trains collided, the results were catastrophic. Wooden passenger cars splintered and telescoped, crushing everyone inside. The Armagh disaster of 1889, caused by brake failure and poor communication, killed 80 people, including many children. Railway accidents became so common that they barely made national news unless the death toll was exceptional. Gaslighting in passenger cars added another danger. Many Victorian railway cars were lit by gas stored in cylinders beneath the car. In a collision, these cylinders could rupture and explode, turning the wreckage into an inferno. Passengers who survived the initial impact burned to death trapped in the wreckage. Railway workers also faced occupational diseases. Constant exposure to smoke, coal dust, and later diesel fumes destroyed their lungs. The noise from trains damaged their hearing. The vibration from locomotives caused a condition called white finger, where circulation to the fingers was damaged, leaving them numb and painful. The railway companies treated workers as expendable. There was no workers' compensation. If you were injured, you were fired. Railway companies fought legal liability claims viciously, arguing that workers had accepted the risks when they took the job. The railways operated 24 hours a day, meaning shift work, night work, and irregular schedules that disrupted sleep and family life. Workers might be called in at any hour and were expected to report immediately or face dismissal. Despite all of this, railway work was considered relatively good employment because it was steady and paid better than many alternatives. Men competed for railway positions. They accepted the dangers because the alternative was worse: casual labor, poverty, or the workhouse. The Victorian railway system moved millions of passengers and millions of tons of freight. It connected the nation and enabled economic growth. But it ran on the broken bodies of the men who operated it. Hospital workers and medical staff in Victorian England, hospitals weren't places of healing. They were charnel houses where the poor went to die. And the people who worked in them, nurses, orderlies, and junior doctors, faced constant exposure to deadly diseases with no understanding of how infections actually spread. Victorian medical theory was still catching up with reality. The germ theory of disease wasn't widely accepted until the 1880s. Before that, most doctors believed in miasma theory, the idea that diseases came from bad air. This fundamental misunderstanding made hospitals extraordinarily dangerous places to work. Nurses, almost exclusively women, worked directly with patients, changing bedding, cleaning wounds, and feeding those too sick to care for themselves. They did all of this with no gloves, no masks, no antiseptic procedures. They worked with open wounds, infectious diseases, and bodily fluids with their bare hands. Hospitals in the early Victorian period were nightmarish. Wards were overcrowded, with beds so close together that patients could reach out and touch the person next to them. Ventilation was poor. Sanitation was minimal. Multiple patients might share a single bed. The smell of decay, infection, and death was constant. Nurses contracted the diseases they treated: typhus, typhoid fever, tuberculosis, cholera, scarlet fever, and countless other infections killed medical staff regularly. There was no concept of infection control. A nurse might go from treating a patient with typhoid to treating a surgical patient without washing her hands, spreading disease from one patient to another and to herself. Florence Nightingale's reforms during and after the Crimean War, 1853-1856, began to change nursing, but progress was slow. Even after her work, hospitals remained dangerous. Nightingale herself contracted Crimean fever, likely brucellosis, during her service, and suffered from its effects for the rest of her life. Surgical procedures were particularly hazardous for medical staff. Before antiseptic techniques were developed by Joseph Lister in the 1860s, surgery was performed in regular clothing, often the same coat the surgeon had worn all week. Surgical instruments weren't sterilized. Surgeons operated with bare hands, often holding scalpels in their mouths between cuts. Post-surgical infection was nearly universal. Wounds almost always became infected, suppurating pus and requiring repeated treatment. Medical staff handling these infected wounds regularly developed blood poisoning themselves. A small cut on a nurse's hand while changing bandages could lead to sepsis and death. The diseases that filled Victorian hospitals were terrifying. Let's catalog some of them. Cholera. Caused by contaminated water, cholera killed through rapid dehydration. Patients suffered violent diarrhea and vomiting, losing liters of fluid in hours. They died with sunken eyes and blue-tinged skin. Medical staff contracted cholera by handling bedding and clothing soaked with infected waste. Major cholera epidemics in 1832, 1849, 1854, and 1866 killed tens of thousands and exposed countless medical workers. Typhoid fever spread through contaminated food and water. Typhoid caused high fever, delirium, and intestinal hemorrhaging. It killed slowly, over weeks. Patients needed constant care, and nurses providing that care regularly contracted the disease. Typhoid killed Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, in 1861, demonstrating that even royalty wasn't immune. Tuberculosis, called consumption because it seemed to consume patients from within, TB was endemic in Victorian England. It spread through coughing and close contact. Hospital workers, constantly exposed to TB patients, contracted it at high rates. There was no cure. Patients coughed blood, lost weight, and slowly suffocated as the disease destroyed their lungs. Medical staff who contracted TB faced the same fate. Puerperal fever. This was infection following childbirth, usually caused by doctors and midwives, transferring bacteria from previous patients or from dissecting cadavers. Before hand washing became standard practice, maternity hospitals had mortality rates exceeding 25%. Women went to the hospital to give birth and died in agony days later from bacterial infection. The medical staff who treated them often contracted infections through open cuts and wounds. Hospital orderlies, usually men, handled the worst jobs, carrying bodies, cleaning operating theaters, and disposing of amputated limbs and other medical waste. They were exposed to blood, pus, and infectious material constantly. Their mortality rates were even higher than nurses because they worked in the most contaminated areas. Asylum workers faced different but equally serious dangers. Victorian asylums housed thousands of patients with mental illnesses, many of whom were violent. Attendants were regularly assaulted, bitten, and injured by patients. The work was emotionally devastating, performed in institutions that were essentially prisons with no effective treatments to offer. The physical conditions in asylums were appalling. Patients were often restrained in straitjackets or chained to walls. They lived in filth because there were insufficient staff to maintain basic hygiene. Attendants worked in these conditions for long shifts, facing constant danger from unpredictable patients. Disease also ravaged asylums. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and other infectious diseases spread rapidly through overcrowded wards. Staff contracted these diseases and carried them home to their families. Morgue workers and those who handled the dead faced unique hazards. Dead bodies, especially those from infectious diseases, remained contagious. Workers who prepared bodies for burial or performed autopsies were exposed to diseases that had killed the deceased. Autopsies were performed with minimal protection, often in poorly ventilated spaces where fumes from decomposing bodies accumulated. During cholera epidemics, the dead were so numerous that handling bodies became an assembly line process. Bodies were stacked in morgues, piled in carts, and buried in mass graves. The men who did this work were constantly exposed to cholera and other diseases. Victorian medical workers were driven by various motivations, some by genuine compassion, others by economic necessity. Nursing, while dangerous, offered women one of the few respectable paths to independence and employment outside domestic service. But regardless of motivation, medical workers paid an enormous price. They suffered from PTSD, though it wasn't called that then, from witnessing constant suffering and death. They contracted diseases that killed them or left them permanently disabled. They worked long hours for minimal pay in conditions that destroyed their health. The Victorian hospital system was built on the sacrifice of its workers, people who tried to heal others in an era when medical science barely understood what caused disease, let alone how to prevent it. The forgotten dead. At the very bottom of Victorian society were the workers who dealt with waste, the refuse of a rapidly industrializing society. These people were so marginalized that they barely appear in historical records. But their work was essential, and it killed them in ways that were slow, disgusting, and completely ignored by everyone else. Let's start with rag pickers, also called rag gatherers. In Victorian England, rags were valuable. Paper was made from rags, and various industries needed fabric scraps. Rag pickers scavenged for discarded cloth, sorting through garbage heaps, gutters, and sewers. This work meant constant exposure to filth and disease. Rag pickers handled refuse that included human waste, dead animals, and contaminated materials from hospitals. They worked with their bare hands, sorting through decomposing garbage for hours each day. The rags they collected often came from cholera victims, typhus patients, or people who had died from other infectious diseases. Rag pickers regularly contracted these diseases. They also suffered from constant infections, parasites, and respiratory diseases from inhaling the dust and mold from old fabric. Children worked as rag pickers. Families sent their youngest children to scavenge because small hands could reach into spaces adults couldn't. These children grew up surrounded by filth, often developing chronic illnesses that killed them before adulthood. Bone collectors gathered animal bones from slaughterhouses, butcher shops, and garbage heaps. Bones were used to make glue, fertilizer, and bone char, used in sugar refining. Collectors carried large sacks through streets, gathering bones that had been rotting for days or weeks. The smell was indescribable. Rotting bones, still covered with bits of putrefying flesh, maggots, and bacteria, were handled daily. Bone collectors developed severe respiratory problems from breathing the fumes. They contracted diseases from handling contaminated bones. The bones were often processed in the collectors' homes, usually single-room tenements. They boiled bones to extract grease and break them down, filling their living spaces with steam and stench. Entire families lived in these conditions, children growing up in rooms where bones boiled constantly. Then there were the night soil men, perhaps the most degrading occupation in Victorian England. Night soil was a euphemism for human excrement. Before modern sewage systems were widespread, human waste was collected from cesspits and privies and disposed of outside the city. Night soil men worked at night, hence the name, because polite society didn't want to see or think about what they did. They descended into cesspits, literally swimming in human waste, to shovel it into carts for removal. The health effects were catastrophic. Night soil men worked in an atmosphere of methane, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia. These gases caused headaches, dizziness, nausea, and with enough exposure, unconsciousness and death. The work destroyed their sense of smell within months. They were constantly covered in feces. It soaked their clothes, their skin, and worked its way into every cut and abrasion. Infections were constant and often fatal. They contracted dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and parasitic infections at extraordinary rates. The social stigma was absolute. Night soil men were pariahs. They lived in isolated communities because no one else would tolerate their presence. They were banned from most pubs and shops. Their children were rejected by other children. The smell marked them permanently, even when they weren't working. Yet this work was essential. Cities produced tons of human waste daily. Without night soil men, cities would have drowned in their own excrement. These men literally kept Victorian cities functioning, and society repaid them with contempt and disgust. Sewer workers, once sewage systems were built, faced similar dangers. London's sewer system, built in the 1860s under Joseph Bazalgette's direction, required constant maintenance. Sewer workers descended into the tunnels to clear blockages, repair damage, and ensure flow. The sewers were filled with toxic gases. Methane explosions killed workers regularly. Hydrogen sulfide poisoning caused sudden collapse and death. Workers also faced drowning when sudden rain caused water levels to rise rapidly. The infamous fatbergs, masses of congealed fat and waste, had to be broken up manually by workers with pickaxes and shovels. Sewer workers also contracted diseases. Leptospirosis from rat urine was endemic. Rats in sewers bit workers, spreading infection. The water in sewers contained every pathogen imaginable, and workers regularly had open cuts and abrasions that allowed bacteria to enter their bloodstream. Knackers, who disposed of dead horses and other large animals, faced similar conditions. Dead horses were a constant problem in Victorian cities. Horses pulled carts, carriages, and omnibuses, and they died regularly in the streets. Knackers hauled the corpses away and processed them for hide, bones, and whatever else could be salvaged. This meant cutting up decomposing carcasses, often in advanced stages of rot. The smell was overwhelming. The work attracted flies by the thousands. Knackers worked in yards where dozens of animal carcasses lay rotting, the ground soaked with blood and fluids. They contracted anthrax, glanders, and other animal diseases. The work destroyed their health, their social standing, and often their will to live. But someone had to do it, and desperate men took these jobs because the alternative was starvation. All of these occupations shared common features. They were essential to urban life. They were extraordinarily dangerous to health. They were socially stigmatized, and they were completely unregulated. These workers had no protections, no safety equipment, and no social support. They died young, often unrecorded, their deaths barely noticed by a society that depended on their labor but preferred not to acknowledge their existence. The reform movement. By the mid-Victorian period, the catastrophic cost of industrialization was becoming impossible to ignore. The bodies were piling up too high, the suffering was too widespread, and occasionally, someone with power and influence actually cared. The movement for workplace safety and labor reform didn't come from the factory owners or the government. It came from workers themselves, from journalists, from a few doctors and social reformers, and from the occasional aristocrat who bothered to look beyond their comfortable estate. One of the earliest reform efforts focused on children. The employment of young children in dangerous industries was so visible, so obviously horrific, that even Victorian society's tolerance for suffering was tested. The Factory Acts, passed gradually over decades, attempted to limit child labor. The 1833 Factory Act prohibited the employment of children under 9 in textile mills and limited the working hours of older children. The 1842 Mines Act banned women and children under 10 from working underground in mines. The 1847 Factory Act limited the working day for women and children in textile factories to 10 hours. These sound like significant reforms, and they were, but their enforcement was laughable. There were initially just 4 factory inspectors for the entire country. 4 men were supposed to inspect thousands of factories. Owners were often warned before inspections, giving them time to hide their youngest workers or temporarily improve conditions. Birth certificates were easily forged or simply non-existent for working-class children. A factory owner could claim a 7-year-old was 10, and there was no way to prove otherwise. The fines for violations were minimal, often less than the cost of hiring adult workers at adult wages. But the acts established a principle that society had some responsibility to protect workers, especially children. This was revolutionary, even if the implementation was inadequate. Public awareness grew through the work of journalists and social reformers. Charles Dickens's novels, while fiction, exposed working-class suffering to middle-class readers who had never seen inside a factory or mine. Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor, published in the 1850s, documented the lives of the working poor in extraordinary detail. Medical professionals began documenting occupational diseases. Dr. Thomas Addison's work on lead poisoning, Sir James Paget's documentation of chimney sweeps cancer, Dr. Charles Thackeray's reports on occupational hazards. All of these contributed to growing awareness that work was killing people in preventable ways. The matchgirls' strike of 1888, which we discussed earlier, was a watershed moment. These young women, among the most oppressed workers in England, successfully organized and won concessions. Their strike inspired other workers and demonstrated that even the powerless could fight back. Trade unions, though still restricted by law and opposed by employers, began to organize workers. The formation of the Amalgamated Society of Engineers in 1851, the National Union of Mine Workers in 1863, and various other unions gave workers collective bargaining power for the first time. Strikes, while often unsuccessful and brutally suppressed, began to occur more frequently. The London Dock Strike of 1889 involving tens of thousands of workers demanding better pay and conditions, succeeded in winning concessions and demonstrated the power of organized labor. The expansion of voting rights also played a role. The Reform Acts of 1867 and 1884 extended the vote to more working-class men, though still not to women or the poorest men. This meant politicians had to at least pretend to care about working-class issues to win elections. By the late Victorian period, meaningful reforms were finally being implemented. The 1878 Factory and Workshop Act consolidated previous legislation and improved enforcement, increasing the number of inspectors and strengthening penalties for violations. The 1880 Employers' Liability Act allowed workers to sue employers for injuries caused by negligence, though the law was limited and difficult to enforce. The 1897 Workmen's Compensation Act required employers to pay compensation for workplace injuries, a revolutionary concept that established employer responsibility for worker safety. Safety equipment began to be developed and slowly adopted. Guardrails on machinery, safety cages in mines, better ventilation, improved lighting, all gradually appeared in some workplaces. Medical understanding improved dramatically. Germ theory revolutionized medicine in the 1880s and 1890s. Antiseptic and aseptic techniques reduced surgical mortality. Occupational medicine began to develop as a field, documenting how specific jobs caused specific diseases. But progress was frustratingly slow. Every reform was fought by business interests who argued that safety regulations would destroy British competitiveness. Every improvement in working conditions had to be wrested from employers who saw workers as expendable resources. And many of the worst industries continued largely unchanged. White phosphorus wasn't banned from match production until 1910. Child labor wasn't effectively eliminated until the early 20th century. Meaningful health and safety regulation didn't arrive until after World War I. The reforms that did occur in the Victorian period were important, but they were compromises, half measures that improved some workers' lives while leaving others to suffer. The truly transformative changes, the comprehensive safety legislation, workers' compensation systems, and labor rights that we consider basic today, those wouldn't come until the Victorian age was over. Let's try to quantify the unquantifiable. How many people died doing these dangerous jobs in Victorian England? The honest answer is, we don't know, and we never will. Victorian England didn't keep comprehensive workplace death statistics. Many deaths, especially of children and those in casual labor, went unrecorded. Workers who died from occupational diseases years after exposure weren't counted as workplace deaths. Those who died at home from injuries sustained at work often weren't included in any statistics. But we can piece together fragments. Coal mining deaths alone averaged over 1,000 per year throughout the Victorian period, with some years seeing significantly more. Between 1850 and 1900, approximately 50,000 coal miners died in industrial accidents. This doesn't include the hundreds of thousands who died from black lung and other mining-related diseases. Railway workers, over 18,000 workplace deaths between 1875 and 1900, according to available records. The true number including earlier periods and unreported deaths is certainly higher. Factory deaths are harder to calculate because different industries kept different records, if they kept any. But estimates suggest thousands died annually in factory accidents, with tens of thousands more dying from occupational diseases. Maritime deaths. British shipping lost over 1,000 vessels annually during peak periods, with an average of 1,500 to 2,000 sailors dying each year. Over the Victorian period, that's potentially 100,000 or more maritime deaths. Construction, agriculture, chemical works, slaughterhouses, tanneries, and all the other dangerous occupations we've discussed, each contributed their own toll. A conservative estimate suggests that occupational deaths in Victorian England numbered at least 5,000 to 10,000 per year. Over Victoria's 64-year reign, 1837 to 1901, that's 320,000 to 640,000 deaths. And this is almost certainly a significant undercount. But deaths are only part of the story. For every death, there were many more serious injuries: amputations, blindness, permanent disability, chronic disease. Hundreds of thousands of workers were maimed, crippled, or sickened by their work. The economic impact on families was devastating. When a primary wage earner died or was disabled, the entire family often ended up in the workhouse. Children lost their childhoods, women lost their husbands, and the cycle of poverty and dangerous work continued into the next generation. The psychological toll is impossible to measure. Imagine knowing that your job could kill you any day. Imagine watching coworkers die and knowing you could be next. Imagine the trauma of seeing someone crushed in machinery or burned alive and then having to continue working in the same place. Victorian workers developed a fatalistic acceptance of danger. They created dark humor about death. They drank heavily to cope with stress and trauma. They developed strong bonds with fellow workers because they knew those people understood in a way no one else could. So what can we learn from this dark chapter of history? What does Victorian England's treatment of workers tell us? First, that technological progress and human welfare don't automatically advance together. The Industrial Revolution made Britain wealthy and powerful, but that wealth was built on broken bodies. Progress for some meant suffering for others. Second, that worker safety doesn't happen naturally. Every protection workers have today, from minimum wage to workplace safety regulations to workers' compensation, was fought for. People died, struck, organized, and struggled for decades to win these rights. Third, that society will tolerate extraordinary suffering if it's inflicted on people considered other or lesser. Victorian middle and upper classes could ignore the suffering of workers because they saw them as different, as less human, as acceptable casualties of progress. Fourth, that economic arguments are always used to resist worker protections. Every reform was opposed with claims that it would destroy business, harm competitiveness, and ruin the economy. These arguments were made about limiting child labor, about basic safety equipment, about every imaginable protection. They were wrong then, and similar arguments are still wrong today. Fifth, that knowledge isn't enough. Victorian doctors documented occupational diseases. Engineers understood how to make machinery safer. Society knew children were dying in mines. But knowing didn't lead to action without political and economic pressure. The Victorian dangerous jobs weren't accidents of history. They were the result of choices. Choices to prioritize profit over safety. Choices to view workers as expendable. Choices to resist reform. Choices to maintain a social hierarchy that valued some lives more than others. Modern workplace safety regulations exist because Victorian workers died in such large numbers that eventually, finally, society decided it was unacceptable. Every safety rail, every protective guard, every workplace regulation represents someone who died or was maimed, whose suffering eventually forced change. We've come to the end of our journey through Victorian England's most dangerous occupations. We've descended into coal mines with children who worked in darkness. We've breathed phosphorus fumes with matchgirls whose jaws rotted away. We've climbed inside chimneys with 6-year-olds who sometimes never came back out. And we've watched as machinery, chemistry, and indifference consumed worker after worker. Victorian England built an empire. It created the modern industrial world. It produced technological marvels and accumulated unimaginable wealth. And it did all of this on the backs, and often the corpses, of working people who had no choice but to risk their lives for poverty wages. The workers we've discussed weren't heroes or martyrs in the traditional sense. Most were just ordinary people trying to survive, feeding their families the only way they could. But their suffering and sacrifice built the modern world. Today, when we benefit from labor protections, workplace safety regulations, and the assumption that work shouldn't kill us, We owe a debt to those Victorian workers. Their deaths weren't meaningless, though they were preventable. Their suffering eventually forced change, though it came too slowly to save them. So the next time you put on safety equipment at work, the next time you see a guardrail on machinery, the next time you benefit from workers' compensation or safety regulations, remember the Victorian workers who didn't have those protections. Remember the children in the mines, the matchgirls, the chimney sweeps, the factory workers, and all the others who died, so that eventually, finally, society decided that workers' lives mattered. Their names are mostly forgotten. Their graves are often unmarked. But their legacy is every workplace protection we have today. And that's something worth remembering. Thanks for sticking with me through this heavy topic. If you found this video informative, please give it a like and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Drop a comment below with your thoughts and let me know what historical topic you'd like me to cover next. Until next time, remember to appreciate the protections you have, because people died to win them for you.